All right. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for such a great turnout, a testament to the event and our speaker, of course. I'm John Goldberg, the interim dean of the law school, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Francis Biddle Memorial Lecture, which will, of course, be delivered by Dorothy Roberts, the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossell Alexander Professor of Civil Rights at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Carey Law School. As many of you may have seen recently, Professor Roberts is not only a distinguished member of the Penn faculty, she just received recognition for being named a 2024 MacArthur Genius Fellow, so why don't we all give her a round of congratulations for that. I'm just going to say, Professor Charles is going to give a formal introduction, so I'm just going to say a word about the lecture and Professor Charles. Francis Biddle, the namesake of this lecture, was a 1911 graduate of the Harvard Law School. He began his career as private secretary to Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and served as U.S. Attorney General during World War II and as the U.S. member of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. The funds to support the Biddle Lecture came from a gift from his widow, Catherine Garrison Chapin Biddle. Catherine Biddle asked that the selection of lecturers reflect, quote, that civil liberties and civil rights were of a particular concern to my husband and thus particularly appropriate subject areas for these lectures. And I can think of no one better than Professor Roberts to address these topics. As I say, Professor Roberts will be introduced by our fabulous colleague, Professor Guy Charles. He is the Charles Ogletree Jr. Professor of Law and the faculty director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice, which hosts the Biddle Lecture series. He is a brilliant scholar, an unparalleled teacher whose work is shining new light on the vital relationship among voting rights, race, and democracy in America. He is also an extraordinarily dedicated institutional citizen on whose wisdom and counsel I and many others rely, probably too frequently. Before joining our faculty, Professor Charles taught at Duke Law School and at the University of Minnesota Law School, where he also served as interim co-dean from 2006 to 2008, condolences. And he has been a visiting professor at Georgetown, Virginia, and Columbia Law Schools. Among his many other accomplishments, he has twice received distinguished teaching awards. So please join me in welcoming Professor Charles.
Thank you so very much, Dean Goldberg. So my mother often may have thought that I was a genius, but I am not. But what I do have is the distinctive pleasure of being close to and introducing an actual genius, and embodied by Professor Dorothy Roberts. Dorothy Roberts is a path-breaking, luminous academic. She is absolutely one of those, as an academic starting in the profession, that you look at and you think about and you see the nature of her work. And in some respects, you both think that is something to aspire to, but it is like a perfect Michael Jordan dunk. You may dream about it, you may hope that one day, but you absolutely know that you can never reach that height for a number of reasons, which is that you weren't blessed with, in his case, the physical, but in her case, the intellectual talent that she is blessed with. She is the Michael Jordan in many respects of our profession, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the word of the MacArthur Fellowship, which they don't even know who I am, but they absolutely have recognized her. As you can see, she is, even before then, she was also recognized as a university professor. That is an indication of the fact that not one school can contain her, that indeed her work and the level of her work is so cross and interdisciplinary that they will allow her to teach in any part of the university and hold multiple appointments across the university. She is someone who has worked in the area of reproductive rights, in the area of family law, in the area of gender and race. She helps us understand, and in fact, her work unearths the multiple ways that racial subordination dominates or helps our health system and the provisions of social service. She carefully and meticulously articulates the way that race is embedded and operates, and the relationship between race and gender, and the relationship among race and gender and law, and how all of those construct a mechanism of inequality. She tells us that we can't simply amend these oppressive structures, that we have to recreate absolutely new approaches for addressing the structural inequalities, in particular in the context of families, to dismantle the system of child welfare that will be unsettling some contexts, but will inspire us to think more critically about the track record and the harmful design of our social institutions, our family institutions, and how they are imbricated with structural gender and racial oppression. I can go on and on. She has 3 amazing books. She wrote the foreword to the Harvard Law Review a few years ago. She has published in all of the relevant and important academic journals. She is a wonderful human being, and I can talk more about the work. But of course, as you know and I know, you are not here to hear my poor rendition of her record when you have the person that you are waiting to hear right in front of you. So without any more ado, please join me in welcoming the Biddle Lecturer for this year, Professor Dorothy Roberts, genius and university professor.
Okay, that was definitely the best introduction I've ever gotten. And Guy is just trying to make up for the fact that I worked so hard to get him to come to Penn, and he turned us down and came here, and that still doesn't make up for it. But I'll forgive him. I'm just so honored to be giving this lecture, especially given that it's dedicated to civil rights and civil liberties, and especially since this was my home for 3 years, and I have so many friends and colleagues. I'm looking out at some of them now. Where did David go? David Wilkins in my graduating class at Harvard. We struggled through it together. No. I remember when you got on Harvard Law Review and we were like, oh, wow, David did it. That was remarkable back then for certain reasons you might be able to imagine. Not because he wasn't brilliant, but because there were so few Black people on the Law Review, or ever on the Law Review. So we were all cheering for him then. I can remember that day. So I'm going to talk about the way in which abortion politics. So I'm just seeing people here that I've never met before, but I follow on Twitter. Let me try. That you look just like your image. All right. Okay, I've got to get it together. I'm just thrilled to be here and to see all of you. So I'm going to talk about the way in which the politics of abortion intersect with the politics of pregnancy, especially criminalization of pregnancy, and also with all of these totally intertwined, the politics of family policing, or what most people call child protection, but you'll see why I call it family policing. So of course, we're all familiar with this cataclysmic decision that we're just learning about, the horrible ramifications of. We all knew that overturning Roe versus Wade was going to be a disaster, I think many of us can remember exactly where we were when the decision came down. I was with my daughter and her two best friends shopping for her wedding gown on that day. And the decision, I'm checking my cell phone throughout it, decision comes down, and I was just stunned. And I said to my daughter, we've got to just sit down and pause. Let me tell you what just happened. And being with these three young women who should have had a future that was far more free than mine. It's just an indelible moment in my mind. And of course, we're learning that everything we feared is even worse. You know, every day it seems like there's someone dies as a result of a miscarriage. I just read a story yesterday about another woman who died as a result of a miscarriage and couldn't get care. We learn about the barriers to travel, even learning about how even in states that allow abortion pretty liberally, it's had a huge impact because people are traveling there to get abortions and they're overloaded, like in New York State. So this is a major decision, but the focus prioritizing abortion as the be-all and end-all of reproductive freedom has historically left out the other kinds of reproductive violations that have happened, especially to women of color, especially impoverished women of color. And so this focus that we tend to still have on the importance of a legal right to abortion, absolutely critical, ignores all the kinds of violations that happened that weren't even seen as reproductive rights violations, even with Roe versus Wade. You know, just as an example, right after Roe versus Wade was decided, the Supreme Court decides Harris versus McRae and says, well, you're not entitled to public funding for abortion. Okay, that's a major violation of reproductive rights that Roe didn't address. And so we have to think about what are other aspects of reproductive freedom that not only should be added to the right to abortion, but are entangled with it. This has been the subject of my books having to do with reproductive justice. I actually have another book. There's 4, Guy. Fatal. Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, which I think is deeply entangled with this subject of reproductive justice. But for now, I just want to point out that, and it's not to celebrate my books, it's to say that my work for the last almost 40 years has been not focused on abortion. Of course, I've been a big defender of the right to abortion, but it's been on the longstanding devaluation of many people's childbearing. So sterilization abuse, welfare restructuring, prosecutions of women who are pregnant and using drugs. All of these ways that Black women in particular, that's been my focus, have been devalued in terms of their childbearing. And then, as I was working on Killing the Black Body, which stemmed from my opposition to the prosecutions of Black women for being pregnant and using drugs, I discovered the child welfare system. You know, of course, I was aware of it, but what I learned is that as Black women were being prosecuted, hundreds were being prosecuted across the country, there were tens of thousands of Black women whose newborns were being taken from them at birth just based on one positive toxicology. And the same kinds of stereotypes, vilification of so-called crack babies and Black women trading sex for crack, and the idea that crack use deprived only Black women of maternal instinct, and all these kinds of stereotypes were also fueling mass removals of newborns from Black mothers. And as I began to investigate it, I was shocked. I was shocked that there hadn't been lots of books written about this form of racism, racial oppression, and that the public was still being fed this propaganda about how this system was saving Black children from their neglectful, abusive mothers. And so I ended up writing a couple more books about the racism in this system. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how my thinking about family policing changed over time. So Roe versus Wade then was not sufficient to address these other forms of reproductive harms to women of color, impoverished white women, people with disabilities, et cetera. And I want to highlight how the Dobbs decision shows that the bans on abortion have led to an entangled, it reveals this. This has been going on already, but the Dobbs decision brings into sharp, unmistakable focus the entanglement of abortion bans and criminalizing pregnancy and family separation. Now, understanding the entanglement of different forms of oppression is one of the insights of Black feminism. I think most of you have probably heard about the idea of intersectionality or interlocking systems of oppression. This is a classic statement of it by the Combahee River Collective in 1977. And it is absolutely important to understand how sexism, racism, heterosexism, class oppression, how they all work together. It's also one, I think, aspect of understanding that is looking at how the practices and policies that support these interlocking systems are also interlocking. And that's the approach I want to take today. How the laws of compelled pregnancy, the laws of criminalizing pregnancy outcomes, the laws that separate families are also interlocking, okay? So the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs ignored how forced reproductive labor and forced family separation were entwined during the slavery era. This is a historic foundation for the intersecting laws of compelled pregnancy and family separation. That intersection was essential to supporting and continuing the institution of slavery. It was absolutely essential, of course, that enslavers controlled or attempted to control through law the reproductive labor of enslaved women. That's how their asset, their chattel property, was reproduced. And it was also essential that they have absolute control, again, attempted legal control. You know, of course, they could never have absolute control because people resist. But the legal entitlement to have authority over the children born to enslaved people was, they went hand in hand. That meant that enslavers could sell at will the children of the enslaved people that they owned through law. And for any reason, as a gift, they could give away children, or a mother or a father. They could, on the auction block, family members could be sold off separately. They could sell a child to meet a debt or to punish the parents. So these two entwined aspects of reproductive violence were essential to the institution of slavery. And I highlight that because I think it's important to understand how we got where we are today, that these ideas that it is legitimate to compel people to give birth for the sake of elites' interests, that it's legitimate to forcibly separate families, and especially that it's legitimate to do it to Black people, stems from these practices and the ideologies that surrounded them that have never been demolished in this nation. It's also important because those practices were the heart of abolitionist opposition to slavery. Peggy Cooper Davis, in her book, Neglected Stories, I think very clearly lays this out, how the most appealing, the most passionate arguments against slavery before Congress that led to the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments were enslaved people describing the horrors of what was considered the sin, the biggest sin of slavery. Taking people's children from them, destroying families during slavery. Of course, there were other horrors as well, but I want to make the point that a central one was family separation and other forms of violation of reproductive autonomy. And so for the US Supreme Court in Dobbs to say that there's no history in the United States of protecting reproductive autonomy and not to find it in the 14th Amendment is totally ahistorical. It's just plain wrong. All right. Now, another aspect of the Dobbs decision that shows the entanglement of bans on abortion and family separation is the argument that anti-abortion activists have long used, holding out adoption as the answer, the remedy for the harms of compelling people to give birth against their will. We will adopt your baby. Those signs have been out in front of abortion clinics for decades, and they were out in front of the Supreme Court during the Dobbs argument. You may recall that Amy Coney Bryant, I'm saying something wrong. Barrett, thank you. I said something wrong. You see, I'm not a genius, I told you. All right, that's old age. When you started out with your mother, I thought you were going to say something about, but anyway. Anyway, she raised this issue. Well, what about safe haven laws? Isn't that the answer to banning abortion? And then Justice Alito, if you've read the Dobbs decision, you'll see that he takes up, this wasn't just during the oral argument as a hypothetical. He takes it up in the Dobbs decision when he cites, without any criticism, the argument of anti-abortion advocates. And he says, quote, I think it's worth quoting it. Now he says they argue, but again, without any criticism of it, states have increasingly adopted safe haven laws which generally allow women to drop off babies anonymously. A woman who puts her newborn up for adoption today, and I think this is his idea, has little reason to fear that the baby will not find a suitable home. Okay, that's another falsehood in the Dobbs decision. And then he drops a footnote citing a 2008 CDC report. Nearly 1 million women were seeking to adopt in 2002. That means they were in demand for a child, whereas the domestic supply of infants relinquished at birth or within the first month of life and available to be adopted have become virtually non-existent. So he sets up this supposedly win-win situation where all you have to do is surrender your baby for adoption and you escape the burdens of parenting, which was the reason why you wanted an abortion, according to this logic, while you meet the unfilled demand for adoptable children. This is wonderful. We should all support these bans on adoption, right? Abortion. So, of course, it's obvious that this completely leaves out the 9 months of pregnancy that you're forced to endure. It completely leaves out the notion that you should have autonomy over whether you want to be pregnant or not. Leaves that out. It only deals with, supposedly, even on its own terms, what happens after you give birth to a baby. But it's also just a falsehood that, in addition to being degrading of people who are pregnant and degrading of children who are adoptable, that they're part of some market system that fulfills the desires of people who want to adopt. Now, far from being a free market transaction, the availability of foster children, which is what these children would be. You are handing, or they leave out so many details that if you just think for a minute, you realize, all right, number one, what happens to these children when you drop them off? You're putting them in the custody of the state. You're not handing them over to a suitable family. You're putting them in the custody of the state. And what's required to get them adopted then? You have to terminate the rights of the parents of this child. All right, so it's not a free market transaction. It is a transaction, if you want to call it that. It's a program, it's a policy, it's a system that is far from supporting people's autonomous decisions. It's a system that's based on coercive removal of children against the will of their family members. And it relies not only on coercion, on threats, and on terror. It relies on, generally, accusations of child maltreatment and investigations of families and threatening them to take their children from them, and then putting many of these children into a system that is well documented to harm children, the foster system. That's the system you'd be putting your child in if you drop your child off. It also ignores what studies have found, like the Turnaway study, that most people who have babies, even if they wanted to have an abortion, it was an unwanted pregnancy, keep their babies. People don't like to turn over their babies to safe haven drop-offs. And we also know from that study and others, that there are emotional, economic, other kinds of consequences when people are forced to parent a child that they didn't intend to parent. Yes, they love this child. That's why they don't want to give them up for adoption, but that doesn't mean they were prepared to parent the child. And having a child you're not prepared to take care of is traumatizing. Didn't the Surgeon General of the United States just issue a report saying it's traumatizing to take care of children even if you wanted them? Okay. Now, this system, let me just explain these images I put up there. The first one to the left, I put professional kidnappers in quotes because you can't see it, but these women are child welfare investigators in Arizona, and they created T-shirts that had across the front, professional kidnapper. Yes, that's what those T-shirts say. And then they thought it was cute to pose with them and put this up on social media. Of course, they learned that there were many people who thought this was not a good idea to call yourself professional kidnappers, and they ended up being fired after there was outrage about it. But think about what would cause somebody who's supposed to be protecting children, investigating child abuse and neglect, to think this is funny. And where did they come up with this idea of professional kidnappers? Because they know that the families that they terrorize think of them as professional kidnappers. I can't tell you how many mothers called social workers, child welfare investigators, caseworkers, professional kidnappers when I worked with them in Chicago when I was first doing my research on this. That's how many people think, probably most people who are targeted by this system. As Joyce McMillan, a great activist in New York City, likes to say, if these services were so good, people would be begging for them. They wouldn't be hiding. They wouldn't be fighting back when they were offered. They're not offered, they're forced upon you. And they don't do anything to help you and your family. They're a list of difficult, often made deliberately difficult tasks that you have to perform to get your kids back or keep them. Okay, so let me go back to my point here, is that it's always been undisputed that Black, Indigenous, and impoverished families are hugely disproportionately targeted by the system, investigated, their children taken, their parental rights terminated. That's never been in dispute. The dispute is over why that is. You know, there's a whole set of child welfare researchers who can't deny this. It's so obvious. You know, you just go into any family court, if they let you do it, some don't let you in, but if you go into any deciding these cases, I guarantee you, if you go in New York or Chicago, San Francisco, you are only going to see families of color. Now, there's some places where you might see some white families, but if not only, the vast majority. It's going to look like this is a system for, in Chicago, Black families. I can tell you, when I started doing this research, and this was now back in the early 2000s, I never saw anybody but Black mothers trying to get their kids back in front of judges. No one else at all, ever. So it's obvious, and the statistics bear that out. The statistics actually don't bear out the real impact, the real racist impact of the system, because they just, like the studies I'm just showing here, but I'll tell you what they say. They say that 1 out of 10 Black children will be taken from their homes by the time they reach age 18. One in, do I have that right? Hold on. Because I think it's worse for Indigenous children. So it's somewhere around there, 1 in 10 for Indigenous and Black children, but it's worse for Indigenous children. The statistic that I think is the most alarming is that, this is from this study here, the lifetime prevalence of investigating child maltreatment among US children. 53%, or half of Black children, will experience a child welfare investigation by the time they reach age 18. So this is the common experience. And as one of these studies concluded, foster care, and I put in brackets, and CPS investigation, is thus quite common in the US, especially for historically disadvantaged racial and ethnic groups. But it's the common experience, investigations for Black children. You know, that cannot be just. That cannot be just. And this has a long history. This, again, comes from a long history of the way in which child removal has been used by the government in the United States. So I already mentioned that family separation was inextricably tied to reproductive servitude, and how Black parents were denied authority over their children. The white enslaver was installed by law as the patriarch of the entire plantation family, including all the children of the enslaved children who were considered his property. But even after slavery ended, and I don't have time to trace the entire history, but just some points in that history of the relationship between child removal and even the formal child welfare system and Black, Indigenous, and impoverished families, shows that this is a system that was designed to oppress people. That the fundamentals of the system haven't changed. the fundamentals of the system are threatening to take people's children away, supposedly, under the pretense that that's going to save these children. That's how the system operates today. And it cannot operate without the threat or the actual threat of or actual removal of children from their homes. It cannot operate without that coercive, terroristic force. That's the basis of it, and that's always been the basis of it. So even after slavery ended, after the Civil War was over, and white people wanted to take back control of Black people's labor, probably most of you have heard about the convict leasing system and Black codes that allowed for police officers to pick up Black people off the street just for being there without adequate reason, and then leasing them out. Of course, we've learned recently that still goes on in Alabama, but leasing them out to companies to rebuild the South, including coal mines. One of the worst, coal mines, where these young people spent the rest of their lives in a coal mine. And of course, died early deaths, and then their bodies were thrown in the back. But you may not have been aware of the way the child apprenticeship system was also used to take back the labor of Black children. And tens of thousands of children, right after the 13th Amendment was passed and states passed amendments abolishing to their constitutions, like Maryland abolishing slavery, giving citizenship rights to freed Black people. The solution then to get back the labor of Black children was to use the apprenticeship system, where white people could go to court, claim that Black parents were neglectful. A judge would decide that the children would be better off in the custody and care of sometimes their actual former enslavers, and put them back to work for those people. At the same time, in the second half of the 19th century, the US military was using child removal as a literal weapon of war. So, when we say that the system weaponizes children to oppress their communities, it literally was doing that in the so-called Indian Wars. And of course, that it continued officially until the 1970s. Again, it continues to this day, but officially, the official policy of the US child welfare system was to remove Native children from their homes on grounds of neglect. I'm not talking about some special program. This was part of the child welfare system. These were child welfare proceedings, and put them in white-dominated orphanages, or better yet, into white adoptive homes. You may know that just last week, President Bill, what's wrong with me? This is why I'm retiring. Oh, don't repeat that. President Joe Biden, I'm gonna get to Bill Clinton. He's in my head. I'm gonna show you. If I hurry up, I'll get to Bill Clinton. I'm gonna get to him. I'm not gonna even make a comment about that yet, but Joe Biden apologized. Wasn't it just a few days ago, for this policy, federal policy of child removal, taking tribal children from their homes to assimilate them, and sometimes completely destroy their tribes through the child welfare system. Now, this continued during the civil rights movement, when white elites and politicians used child removal as a way of trying to quash the civil rights movement, and in retaliation, a backlash against the rights that Black people were gaining through the civil rights activism, including the right to welfare. Before the civil rights movement, Black people were largely denied any kind of assistance for their children. That was seen as a program mainly for white children. And the government did not have any major system of taking children away from their families, most of the money that the federal government spent, yes, there was the removal of Native children, as I mentioned, there were the child apprenticeships, taking Black children away from their families, and I skipped over the orphan trains that grabbed up impoverished white immigrant children and shipped them from the East Coast to the Midwest to work on farms, strangers' farms. But most money spent for assisting impoverished families was given to intact families. Okay, it's never been enough. It's never been enough to pull all US children out of poverty. It's never been enough to do that. But there was this idea that the federal government should be assisting impoverished families with welfare benefits. Okay, Bill Clinton, by the way, signed the law ending that. That's what I'm going to get to. But of course, so Black people, Black mothers, impoverished Black mothers began to get welfare benefits, and we can see two things coinciding. One, the beginning of a policy that if you didn't have a suitable home, you couldn't get benefits, and then in 1961, making it a formal policy that if you didn't have a suitable home, you were denied welfare benefits, your children should be taken from you and put in foster care. Okay, that is when we see the beginning of this massive foster care population in the hundreds of thousands, and we also see the beginning of most federal funds, 10 times more federal funds spent on maintaining children outside their homes than inside their homes. All right, you cannot understand that policy if you don't see how white supremacy fueled that policy. Not only white supremacy in the sense that it was in the interests of white supremacist politicians, government agents to end this idea that Black people, Black families were entitled to government assistance, but also white supremacy in the sense of the images, the stereotypes that made it seem all right to take massive numbers of children from their homes. The stereotypes that say that Black mothers can't take good care of their children. They shouldn't be having children. And the stereotypes that say that Black fathers are absent and they don't care about their children. All right, so what we see then in the family policing system, and believe me, I'm going to try to leave a little time for Q&A, and you can read my book Torn Apart to learn more, and other books that are written about it as well, about this system, that there is this logic behind it, a carceral logic that treats harms to children that are caused by structural inequalities, by structural racism, by racial capitalism, by poverty, caused by inequitable structures, and blaming those harms on parents, treating them as if they're so-called child maltreatment. And by the way, most children in foster care are there because of neglect, which is basically defined as poverty. It's defined as you haven't met the material needs of your children. And most people who don't meet the material needs of their children, it's because they can't afford it. And you know what? The people that don't meet the needs of their children who are wealthy, they don't get put in this system. They get referred to private counselors, private drug treatment. I could go off on the evidence we know that wealthy people harm their children too. They neglect their children in many, many ways, and it's not considered child maltreatment. Okay, so but what these harms that are caused by poverty, caused by structural inequities, are then treated as if they're the fault of pathological parents. And the cure for that is therapy, mandated sessions with counselors, mandated parental training, mandated meeting with your caseworker, mandated admit you're a bad parent. Don't be defiant. If you're defiant, you risk losing your children forever, your rights being terminated. If you miss a meeting with your caseworker, that can be grounds for terminating your parental rights because you didn't do everything in the list of mandated so-called services. It means that family defenders, I see some here, may be the only place, as Kathleen Creamer, managing attorney of the Family Defense Unit at Community Legal Services in the town where I live, Philadelphia, had pointed out to me. I interviewed her for a podcast I did, and she said my lawyer's office and other lawyers' offices as well are the only safe place in the state of Pennsylvania for a mother in crisis to go and ask for help without fear of being reported to a child welfare hotline. This is the result of caring for children through threats and coercion and family separation. Now, compelling pregnant people to give birth has increased state removals of children. There's some evidence of that. I think there'll be more evidence coming out that it will, because it puts parents in a more precarious position. You're forcing people to give birth to children they were not prepared to care for. It's more likely they'll meet the definition of neglect, inability to provide food, clothing, housing, medical care, education to their children. This report, Pregnancy as a Crime by Pregnancy Justice, points out that a lot of the policing of pregnancy is tied to mandated reporting, to child abuse hotlines, and to, what's this other one? Oh, just the involvement of the child welfare system. That's what these graphs show. All right. Black women's historical experiences of reproductive violation help also to illuminate the intersecting laws that compel pregnancy and laws that criminalize pregnancy. And I've spoken a little bit about this already, the longstanding stereotypes that emerged immediately after the end of slavery. This is the book, The Plantation Negro as a Free Man, by Philip Bruce, where he claims that Black mothers liberated from slavery will not be able to care for their children. And then the stereotype, and I'm leaving out, a lot of stereotypes, but it's connected to the stereotypes that came out of the Reagan administration that Black women have babies just to get a welfare check, and then because they don't care about their children, spend it all on themselves. These ideas led to mass sterilization of Black women into the beginning of the 1950s. Also, as we could see it as a backlash against the civil rights movement as well, another connection. And we know continued into the 1970s. We also know that this practice has continued in prisons because of the expose of a sterilization program in women's prisons in California. And also there was a whistleblower who pointed out that this was happening in an ICE detention center in Georgia. Probably lots more going on in prisons. It's very hard to get information about what people are being coerced into in a prison. It led also in the okay, I'm going to go a little faster now because I wanted to leave a little time for Q&A, and I see that my time is short, and we have to leave out of here at 1:20. Okay, so I'm not going to tell any more jokes or anecdotes or anything. All right, to the mass prosecutions of Black women for being pregnant and using drugs, something that had never happened in US history. There was no precedent for criminalizing women for their conduct during pregnancy. No precedent. That's why prosecutors had to use all sorts of newfangled theories that this was drug distribution through the umbilical cord, and they're using child abuse statutes to say, well, it's fetal abuse. Okay, so this began in the late 1980s. And then it led to the criminalizing of pregnancy outcomes, not just kind of during pregnancy, but miscarriages and stillbirths, beginning with the prosecution of Regina McKnight, convicted of homicide by child abuse, sentenced to 20 years in prison. She got out after 8 years because finally she got a lawyer who could show that her prior lawyers never adequately contested the bogus testimony that she caused the stillbirth. All right, now, when Roe was on the precipice of being overturned, I went on MSNBC and I said, this is going to lead to women being prosecuted for miscarriages and stillbirths because it's already happening. There was a backlash against me by all these anti-abortion rags but I just want to say they said it was an outlandish and feverish fantasy that came from the wildest corner of my mind that this would ever happen. It's never going to happen, they said, because they didn't want people to believe that banning abortion would lead to something so atrocious as prosecuting people for miscarriages and stillbirths. But it has happened. It has happened. And we saw, right away that women were being prosecuted for these pregnancy outcomes, using very abuse of a corpse when flushing the fetus down the toilet as a result of a miscarriage, right? And other kinds of prosecutions. The Pregnancy Justice Report found that there have been more than 200 prosecutions for some kind of pregnancy-related outcome. Criminalizing pregnancy meets family policing through mandated reporting of what doctors are told they have to report fetal abuse. And so now you have fetal abuse expanding the grounds for family separation. All right, you're seeing the connections here, okay? The false claim that Black women having abortions are committing genocide is also belied by the aftermath of Dobbs, which includes increasing maternal mortality rates, especially against of Black women, and especially in the states where there are the most severe restrictions on abortion. And we already have several deaths, probably more, because of the fear that doctors have that they'll be prosecuted for treating someone who is having a miscarriage or an abortion that requires extra medical care. All right, I'm going to move to the end. I skipped over Bill Clinton signing. That's him signing the welfare restriction law, but no, he also signed a year later the Adoption Safe Families Act, which deals with the exploding foster care population by terminating the rights of parents and incentivizing adoption, okay? See the connections, okay. Reproductive justice has always included everything that I've been talking about. From the very beginning, it's noted that reproductive freedom and justice has to include the right to abortion, but it also has to include the human right to have a child and also to parent a child in a safe, supportive, and sustainable community. I'm going to skip over this and just move to my end because maybe there's 3 minutes for Q&A, which is that it's not just important to connect the interlocking systems of oppression, the interlocking ways that oppressive systems target marginalized communities for oppression to support these hierarchies of race and gender and class, but also to recognize that our movements against these forms of oppression should be interlocking. And so I call all of you, if you see these connections whatever piece of it you're working on, to see it's connected to these other pieces, and to work toward a society where compelling people to give birth, where punishing people for pregnancy, criminalizing pregnancy, where forced family separation as a means of meeting human needs would be unimaginable. And that means working toward a society where we actually support people, where we actually meet human needs through community-based efforts to be caring and supportive and equitable to each other. So I'll end there. At least I ended by 1:20, and hopefully we have to go. Do we have time for one or two questions? Okay. Yeah, understand. Yeah.
How do you keep yourselves accountable to the community that you're serving?
By working with, bye, David. Working with organizations, grassroots organizations, I think that's essential, absolutely essential. So from the beginning, from my work on killing the Black body, from when I first began teaching and writing on these topics, I've always been involved with grassroots organizing. I was fortunate with Killing the Black Body was the beginning of the reproductive justice movement, as we know it now. Obviously, there were roots going back to, hundreds of years, but I can't imagine having written any of my books or any of my articles just theorizing about it. How did I even know to write Shattered Bonds? It's because I met with a group of Black women in Englewood called Operation Moses, Mothers Organizing something, something, something. You already know that my memory is, I can't remember acronyms anymore. Mothers Organizing for System Equality, something like that. And they told me their stories of what happened to them, and I tried to help them with, however I could, going with them to administrative meetings, writing briefs for them, whatever it took, just helping them out, driving them places, and listening to their stories and putting those stories into my book with their permission, putting it into my book. And same with Torn Apart now. I've worked very closely with JMAC for Families, the Upend movement. I guess Upend isn't really grassroots, but it certainly is connected to grassroots organizing. Family defenders offices in Philadelphia. I'm involved with the Crossroads Women's Center, and if you watch the MacArthur video, a big part of it was filmed at the Crossroads Women's Center, and we're planning a symposium at Penn on April 10th called "The Right to Care." The right caregivers versus the care industry, which is co-organized by my program on race, science, and society, and a number of grassroots organizations and activist organizations, international ones that are fighting for a society that supports caregivers, and so I think it's essential I know it's been essential for my work. I wouldn't want to have the audacity to think I could write about these topics without working with the people who are harmed by these systems and fight alongside them. I cannot, I'm a worrier. I'd be up all night. Did I write the right thing? What? And it also guides me so much to know what are the things we should do. Like, here's Joyce McMillan there. I get a lot of times, should we be supporting this law? Talking to Joyce about how this law is going to help to shrink the power of the Administration for Children's Services in New York, and could do it other places as well, is really important to me. Otherwise, I be worried that I reached the wrong conclusion if I was just thinking about it in my head. So, family defenders. Some people might say, oh, well, isn't that being part of the system? But you know why I say no, it isn't? I support family defenders because I have talked to so many mothers who have been investigated, and they tell me, I wish I had a lawyer when they took my children or before they took my children. I've never talked to anyone who's been targeted by the system who said, no, we don't need lawyers. We want to work outside the, no. So that's, otherwise maybe I would write something that says, oh, family defenders are part of the system. No, because that seems logical, because we're opposing the system. No. Yeah, sorry. I want to say that's the.